Hello and welcome to a Byline Times special with me, Hardeep Matharu, the editor-in-chief of Byline Times, and I'm joined by Peter Jukes, its co-founder and executive editor. The Gulf of America, Trump's first month. That's the subject of our discussion today, Peter. Now, you've been quite shocked, perhaps not surprised, but shocked by recent developments, their impact not just for America, but also for the UK, Europe, the entire world.
Yeah, we could talk maybe about the Middle East and his Gaza plan later. But the biggest thing, I think, just in terms of scale and historical import, is his behind-the-scenes deal with Putin over Ukraine. Two things important about this. I mean, you know, the horrors of Gaza. Ukraine's a country of 40 million. Millions occupied, 5 million occupied by the biggest wartime aggression since 1945 in Europe. And it appears, and we can talk about the trip, the Munich summit with the Vice President J.D. Vance, what he said. But basically, Trump has said, I'm going to meet Putin. I'm going to sort it out. Don't need Zelensky. Don't need Europe. And what has emerged, I think, something we all feared, conceptually was his thinking America first. That means America above NATO and any of the alliances. Here is living proof. An earthquake in terms of 80 years of post-war history. I mean, some people say it's earthquake like 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism. But, as I wrote in an editorial, for 80 years, British foreign policy has been premised around the ideal we stick with the world superpower. It's got nuclear weapons, it's strong, it's like one of its 17 naval carrier fleets has the entire firepower of Italy, for example. But not only that, and I think we could debate this at length, America on the margins would enforce its hegemony in quite shocking and scary ways, as in, say, Latin America, places like Chile and Nicaragua, in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, in Iraq, and failed to do in Iran. But in the core of Europe or Canada, Australia, there was a willing sheltering under the nuclear umbrella and a sense that though the US would give as much as it took, we'd do trade deals with them, they'd look after us, we liked their culture. It seemed to, have some bad things to it. It had Hollywood, it had box sets of TV, it had pop music, jeans, that has been my whole life, and I'm 63, right? That America, the brave, America, the guarantor, America, the bully. But, when it came to Vietnam, who protested against it? More than anybody, Americans. That world is now gone. A terrible beauty is born. Everything is changed. I'm quoting W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poets. Everything is changed utterly. And, this has huge consequences for us, doesn't it? Because where does Brexit Britain sit?
I mean, in terms of keeping with America, Trump won this election promising it would be America first, especially in foreign policy. This idea that the American people or his supporters don't want the US to be tied up in wars in Europe, elsewhere, that don't really concern them. So I guess from that point of view, in terms of his voters, he's sticking to what he said. Quite infamously, Trump said, I can stop the war in an hour. He said that it's a ridiculous conflict. It has to be worked out. But as you said, he's had this phone call with Vladimir Putin, then had a phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, very much informing him that these talks would be beginning. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. But in terms of what's on the table, it's very much in the direction, it seems, from Trump-Putin, that Zelensky would have to agree to give up Crimea, the land that has already been taken by the Russians. This is so far from what Ukraine has fought for a number of years now. And it's worrying because it would be giving in to the aggression of Putin. People have raised the point immediately that if Putin is emboldened in this way, he's going to do it again. Where's next after Ukraine?
Well, it was the first major redrawing of boundaries in Europe since 1945. In the previous history of Europe, redrawing boundaries by force was not a good one. I fought 2 world wars. 120 million casualties of the second one. Not only does it embolden Putin, who could use a ceasefire to rebuild defenses and strike again, it emboldens every despot, everybody who wants in this new game of superpowers to redraw boundaries, the big at the expense of the weak. And Taiwan would be on the list, high up on the list, therefore. Somebody like
but
China.
That's really interesting what you just said about this new game of the superpowers. I think this notion that in Trump's America is a superpower, but not one that wants to be central to this global position of the world's policeman.
Well, see, the world's policeman, the assumption with the world's policeman, and obviously many criticisms of its actions and could be seen to be wrong, aggressive or corrupt. But now we have the world's gangster because it's completely lawless. I mean, everything, the way Trump
You mean
behaves.
America, Russia?
America. I mean, we know that Russia is a kleptocracy and is, being run by oligarchs who stole the money from their people. America now is heading that way.
America, the world's gangster.
Well, instead of the world's, it's like that cop in Godfather 1 who's shot by Michael Corleone is working for the bad guys. So you can assume that Trump, when he goes to Zelensky, his Treasury Department went over the weekend with Jack Posobiec, read an article on Byline Times, who he is, and said, we want all your minerals or half your minerals in return for the aid we've given you.
Ukraine's minerals.
Yeah, take Ukraine's minerals. Zelensky, I can't sign this. He can't sign on behalf of the people. It's not. It's acting like a protection racket.
So American gangsterism.
American gangsterism. No longer the policeman, but the gangster. Imagine the policeman becomes a gangster. So the problem is with this, and obviously great American dramas, High Noon, when the sheriff, the bad guys take over the town, right? The bad guys are in charge. Is that American power resides in that not being the case. So there was an America First movement in the 1930s that didn't get power, and instead a different America, an engaged America, maybe too engaged for some people, and that was the basis of the world order, the post-world world order, that it didn't turn inside, and people voluntarily ascribed to American hegemony. If it's forced on you, Zelensky told, give us your minerals or else. One move and I shoot the kid. Nice country you got there. Shame if I broke it. Does that work? Because it doesn't work for Vladimir Putin. It kind of works for China with its investments. But the hyper-realist world of the great superpowers, that's what World War I and II, everybody playing each other off, just going for their national interest rather than the globalized world thinking of that, the global interest. I don't think America would be that powerful. And look, Zelensky has refused Trump. Meanwhile, Trump said, we're not bringing Europe to engage in this situation, which is the center of Europe, Ukraine, which is extraordinary, saying, Europe's given more money than Trump in terms of material, in terms of aid, in terms of arms. On whole, it's given more than Trump. And so you've got this position where America no longer underpins the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is retreating. So what comes in its stead? I think that's the really interesting thing this week. Don't know what happened by the time this goes out, but Macron, Starmer, all the main heads of government in Europe are meeting in Paris this week to their response to this sort of behind-the-scenes Putin-Trump plan. But let's get back to it. There's nothing in Trump's plan which isn't in Putin's favor. So that leads to the extraordinary thing. It's not only does Putin occupy 20% Ukrainian territory, 5 million Ukrainian citizens are under occupation. We've seen what happens to Ukrainian citizens under Russian occupation. God knows how many dead and missing in Mariupol, one of the biggest cities under occupation. So I don't think that the facts on the ground will allow this, and we can talk about that in more detail, will allow Trump's plan to come to fruition. He said all this in the first term. The guardrails were there. There were people like Millet. There are lots of people in the White House and in these, but now he's cut a swathe. There's nothing holding him back. Doesn't mean it will work.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because his election platform was, as I said, this very much America first, America doesn't need to have this role in global affairs. We shouldn't be getting tied up in things that are not really to do with us. But this is quite an interesting dynamic in that it's not that Trump has retreated. No. He's very much calling the shots with regards to Ukraine and Putin. And therefore, it's quite an interesting development that America first perhaps does mean American aggression on the world stage.
Yeah.
You know, they intervene when it is suitable and kind of convenient for the Trump administration. But in terms of Europe and NATO and those wider considerations of those social democracies that make up the continent, that is what he is retreating from. But in terms of Trump and Putin, let's just look at that for a moment, because, I mean, in some ways, this channel that exists between the two of them, does that not just give weight to a lot of the reporting Byline Times and a few other journalists have been doing consistently over the years, that actually the Trump administration is something that Putin has always desired? It will work in his favor in terms of his imperial ambitions in Europe. I mean, surely this gives credence to something that was called a conspiracy theory that has been easy to shut down. Although the Mueller report after the 2016 presidential election in America did find that there had been collusion between the Trump administration.
It didn't quite find collusion. But there's no crime against communication. There'd been communication. They could not quite prove that it had been incited and organized with the assent of Trump's campaign. Well, the individual members, they could. It did find them. Russia had been pushing for Trump to get elected, clear as day. Had lots of financial interests in Trump, as we proved in Sergei and the Westminster spy ring. The GRU poured money into Brexit. There were key strategic aims, but proving that the recipient of that largesse, those influence operations, encouraged and knew them. Even though we said to Russia, are you listening? Get Hillary's emails. But now I think you're right. Now it's kind of beyond doubt, and it's extraordinary. Putin's economy is smaller than Spain's. He is losing rapidly on the front. I mean, he lost 15,000 troops this month in January alone on this front. Pokrovsk, they didn't get it, supposed to get it in October. What does Putin have over Trump? Now, it needn't be famously PP tapes or compromat. There's something about the way Putin operates which clearly impresses Trump. He's been on the phone to him, as has Musk, and with Putin's office for the last 2 years. There is something, Trump is both impressed by Putin, maybe a little bit scared of him, these private conversations they had in Helsinki. And the compromat, the spy, the acronym describes how you get somebody as an asset or an agent if you're a spy. It's put down to the word MICE: money, ideology, compromising material, C, and ego. Now, definitely ego, definitely money. He had all these plans to, build hotels in Moscow, and ideology, kind of maybe, because what there is a long-standing, now 10-year kind of alliance between right-wing forces in Russia, which is not left at all. It's semi-fascistic philosophers like Ilyin, like Dugin, all about families, anti-LGBT, women knowing their right place in the home. There is an ideology there. And ego, of course. Now, but Putin's not long for this world, as Zelensky. And it seems to me there must be something darker and deeper for Trump to give up everything, really, all his credibility in NATO. Whatever you say about the costs of being the world policeman, it also gives you a lot of influence. And he's going to lose it.
But, I mean, arguably Trump is doing what he promised his voters he would.
Well,
so when we talk about authenticity today in politics, whether we like it or not, Trump is somebody who can at least make a somewhat credible claim to his voters. I said America first. I mean America first.
No, look.
Is it that, I mean, it's interesting to explore, isn't it? Is it that Trump's loyalty lies with Putin, or ultimately he has to be seen to be delivering something tangible to his voters? We've often talked about sort of Biden or maybe the Keir Starmer deliverism sort of problem, that this notion of just sort of telling people that the economy is improving or the NHS waiting lists are going down isn't viscerally as significant as Trump telling the whole world, I've talked to Putin, Zelensky, you have to do this, Europe, you're out of it.
Yeah, and people love that.
It's kind of,
strongman.
it's performative as well as it is concerning. It's quite a show of Trump to
So as we always say
do
about
this.
populism, it's very encouraging at first, and then reality steeps in. But I don't doubt there's a large section of the American population love this stuff. And so the optimistic side of this, or rather, this is a crisis we needed to face. America, and this to a certain extent, it was true that NATO wasn't pulling its weight. The European states had higher social security because they spent less on defense. Whereas America, by being the policeman of the world, had to arm itself all the time and couldn't spend so much on benefits. Germany, to extent, France, lesser extent, could have great social services because it didn't have to defend itself. It relied on American nuclear umbrella and power. And we should have fixed the roof while the sun was shining. I do think we now need a European army. One of the great things is...
Which is exactly the stuff that the Brexiters were saying we never ever wanted. That's an interesting pickle we'll come on to.
No, exactly. It's kind of confounds Brexit in a deep and an important way. And then there are divergences. You have right-wing governments in Slovakia and Hungary who are objecting to letting fast-tracking Ukraine to NATO, which, by the way, Keir Starmer says is still on and Trump says is not on. So interesting divergences there. Basically, they're not going to fight each other. Why? They all have one bloody currency. World War II is not going to happen just on a material basis. And the founders of the European Coal and Steel Union, which was the origin of the EU, and I think we both went to that exhibit in Brussels about that, knew this, that you wouldn't get France and Germany fighting each other if they both had equal access to the resources, the coal and steel, that was the constant battleground of two world wars. So Europe is, in some profound way, unified in a way that I don't think Trump understands. And so we should have faced this moment before. I am pleased to see Starmer step up, the Germans step up, Macron step up, because actually more than the EU, this common security issue is really activated. Ukraine is on the borders. Next stop is Poland or Hungary. It is part of Europe. If we're not fighting there, we'll be fighting in Poland or in Latvia or Lithuania.
I mean, another plank of the Trump administration's attacks on Europe has been J.D. Vance, the vice president, has talked a lot about free speech in Europe and how it's sort of withering away very much, in alignment with AfD. I mean, there's an election coming up in Germany. Also, these sort of, as you say, these traditional culture war values and sort of divisive wedge issues that Trump, Vance, sort of that's their bread and butter. Family, tradition, women's place, free speech. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, because the person who's in their administration, Elon Musk, owns X, who literally controls the algorithm. So much for free speech. But it's interesting that not only is this about foreign policy and geopolitics, you still have those cultural aspects coming in as well via the vice president.
And we see them in British politics. We see sort of people like Claire Fox going, oh, they're right, he's right about this cancel culture. Can we just say something about cancel culture? If you just hold up a white piece of paper in Russia, you can be put into prison for 5 years. They basically murdered Navalny, the opposition leader. They've killed hundreds of journalists. They're completely censored media. If we're going to stand up for free speech, the front lines of Ukraine is one place to do it, not by supporting the neo-Nazi party, the AfD. I think Vance's speech went down like a lead balloon, and it shows how in that free speech absolutism put by Musk, which basically means corporations have rights to free speech, all comes from Citizens United. Yeah, free speech, that means we can pour billions into political campaigns as a corporation. We have a right to free speech. It's completely bankrupt. It makes no more sense here than their Fourth Amendment does, which is the right to bear arms. You're not allowed to bear arms here. And it shows, Hardeep, I think, something I've felt for years. I realised I've married American. 3 of my siblings have married American. But the gulf culturally between the UK and America and the rest of Europe is much bigger the key indicators of this, nearly across Europe, except for Poland, that's probably changed now, we're very secular. It's like, only like 20% go to church, 30%. In America, it's double. On things like guns, like capital punishment, all those things actually in the ECHR, the right to life. Americans don't believe in those things. And culturally, that split, there's Pew Research just showing we've been drifting apart from America quite a long time.
So I want to look at Britain and its role globally and what it does now. But before we move on to that, I want to go back to this point about Putin and Trump. So whatever the ideological associations or wherever Trump's loyalty ultimately lies, Trump being supportive of Putin or ultimately trying to satisfy his voters with some big set pieces that he promised them as part of the America First agenda. I think there is, an argument to be made that for Putin, Trump is quite a good vessel. And I think this notion of Trump being a vessel is really, really interesting. So during his first term, it was very much, wow, this is a shock. It's all about Trump. He is this sort of very key figure who has managed to drive a very personally driven campaign to, this shock result. I think, a slightly different thing going on this time round. I mean, in the last few weeks, we've had that impromptu press conference that Elon Musk sort of conducted from the White House with Donald Trump sat at his desk.
What did the boy say?
I don't know what he said.
The kid said, "Get out, you're not the president, get out." He was. Have you not seen the transcript?
I haven't actually.
The little boy, his kid, kept on looking at Trump. You're not the president. Have you not seen?
No, I should have. God, I should have watched that. That's really interesting.
It's so funny, and you can see Trump like a big kid.
Because he's really upset. Yeah. So obviously I didn't know that. That's really God. Well, they do say kids say very truthful things. So there you go. Okay, so there's that very famous visual sort of representation of it, but also this. So in recent weeks, a memo. An anonymously written memo from people who previously or who do work in Silicon Valley, previously part of something called the neo-reactionary movement, which is also known as the Dark Enlightenment, put together this memo, which has come to light because of the US journalist Dave Troy, who shared it via social media. So this memo is basically warning that about this notion of Trump being a vessel. And whose vessel is he? He's a vessel for this neo-reactionary movement, which Elon Musk is carrying out on its behalf. Can you just say a little bit more about what that movement is about and how Musk fits into its aims and how that is being borne out by some of the actions that Musk is taking in terms of access to information, data, and a lot of information from the government.
Yeah, we should go into detail about what Musk is actually in Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, which is also a meme coin. It's got a joke name. So I think the real convergence with the oligarchs and Russia, right, and Putin, because we know Trump, David Sachs investigated. He's a great friend of Peter Thiel. He's a friend of Elon Musk from the days back on PayPal days. A lot of investments in Russia, very pro-Russian statements throughout the last 2 years by these people, including Musk. So what is going on there? I think it is about the rules-based order and their despisal of it. And if you look at what does Putin represent? He represents, like Starlink, a massive transfer of public funds to a private corporation. Putin is basically, all the oligarchs, what he's done is reputably even richer than Musk, Putin, with his offshore accounts, is extract the value of the state and turn it into oligarchy. In a way, you can see all those oligarchs quite liking that. There's also a thing about extractive industries. There is Nafiz Ahmed, who's written up Dave Troy's memo, leaked memo too, is that they don't like things, alternative fuels, sustainable energy, very much focused around the carbon extraction, which is Putin's whole empire is based on. The long-termists among those oligarchs thinks global warming is going to happen anyway. Peter Thiel thinks there's going to be a catastrophe. and 1 billion people will be left. Obviously, he'll be one of those 1 billion people, and that's what you plan for. So
and the neo-reactionary movement, the Dark Enlightenment, this notion that, the very existence of democracy will get in the way of us progressing.
So I think there's whatever the direct financial or personal acquaintances, we know there are lots of ties. They like Putin as a disruptor in the same way they're tech disruptors, that he's undermining the EU, works a lot with AFD. AFD, actually one of their organisers, were former member of the FSB. The links, Musk and Vance supporting the AFD is not just about them being neo-Nazis, them being pro-Russian.
And this idea then that Trump is the man who won the election, but he's not really in charge. I mean, it was sort of intimated during the election campaign, but to what extent do you think that is being borne out?
Well, you have to be very careful, haven't you? Because with Trump, as soon as Steve Bannon was put to be the real president, he was ousted. And obviously he's
back now, so...
Well, but not in the administration. He was ousted from the White House, Bannon, as their chief of staff. I mean, the people are a lot playing on Musk. Oh, he's the real president, in order to annoy Trump. But I think you've hit on a very important thing. Underlying this is opportunism and money and greed and demonstrative power. And it floats around who's good for, is Trump a front man for them? To a certain extent. It's like Boris Johnson was a front man for the Leave campaign. But also, is he just using this coalition? So the coalition, the new bit, is in the last fight. I mean, the tech bros were pretty neutral in 2016. Definitely Russia was involved. Definitely the Heritage Foundation and the evangelical wing. Now you have a weird alliance. I always said, basically have tech bros, porn billionaires allying with evangelicals. How's that gonna work? And then what they added was RFK, the wellness community, co-vaccine, anti-vaccine movement. Tulsi Gabbard, who's now the head of all the intelligence services, she's more in the kind of pro-Russia wing of things. You have Hesketh, who's kind of the Fox News element, the macho guy who's got various allegations about sexual behavior while in the army at his various jobs. So they've brought together anti-trans, evangelical, pro-porn, pro-tech, pro-Bitcoin. And who's going to win in this festering, bubbling cauldron of different interests? Because it's not consistent. The thought is, on your lines, if Trump is, why the tech bros did a deal with him, because their man, J.D. Vance, was a heartbeat away from the presidency. He was schooled, he's funded by Peter Thiel, the founder of Palantir and PayPal, and he's very much the tech pros guy. And so if something happened to Trump, he's the president. That is the dominant faction at the moment. But how that survives, whoever knows. Because you can't see the interest in somebody, a soccer mum who's worried about trans people, and a Muslim person who doesn't like, what Biden and Kamala Harris did in Gaza. Their interests are completely not aligned.
But I guess the other thing about these tech bros, including Elon Musk, we talked about this before, the memification of them. They are these sort of characters and personality. I mean, they're even called the tech bros. They're kind of colorful and still portrayed that way, especially with Musk and his access to framing the narrative in terms of X, his platform. I mean, it's even if the average Trump voter or, American right now, as you say, they have quite divergent interests, this coalition. But if you didn't know much else about J.D. Vance or the tech bros, you might just think, well, they're quite interesting. It must be quite innovative and creative if they are the tech bros. Why not have people like that in the US government? Maybe that's exactly what we need after years and years of the system not working. I mean, it's quite interesting because obviously there's what's going on behind the scenes, which is where they have huge amounts of probably access and influence and this interesting dynamic with Trump, but also in terms of what is being presented to the American voters that voted for this second Trump administration. At the moment, America first, we're going to tell Ukraine what to do on this. That seems like quite a decisive thing. Then all these tech bros, you have Elon Musk in the Oval Office with Trump answering his own questions. I mean, it's a very, if nothing else, it's not business as usual. No. Having Musk in the Oval Office with his son, that visually, it was funny, but also significant in that there is no way that this is American politics as it used to be. And I wonder whether that in itself is the most powerful thing that Trump can offer the American people who voted for it.
But Heidi, I completely agree. And we've got to look at the preconditions, why Trump seemed like a good option to a lot of people. Business as usual wasn't working, the sense that Congress was a swamp or it's broken, there's impasse. But all that can be true. And you and I know people who go, oh, what's wrong with Musk? You know, they don't know the level of information we have about him, his background in apartheid, his support for Nazis, his whatever he's doing with Doge, but we'll get to that later. But we went through that. We had a tech pro in the Rose Garden explaining why he had driven to Barnard Castle to test his eyes.
Dominic Cummings.
We had a prime minister doing extraordinary things, rolling around, having parties, making these statements, these huge speeches, unilaterally, so threatening a hard Brexit and no deal. We've been through that, right? The thing is, does it work? So I agree. I mean, it's great entertainment. It is.
That's what politics is for a lot of people.
But, okay, yeah, it is until they come for you. Now, I know Americans who've had to flee the country, not because they're directly in threat, but if they've worked with the FBI, if they've helped combat disinformation, they are going to get targeted, right? We have people being made redundant across red states, people not being able to access the, people being sacked from science community across the board, climate change, the parks.
But arguably, these would all be people who didn't vote for Trump.
No, not necessarily. I mean, that's the funny thing.
So they're not going to see the light.
The big parks?
Because they didn't vote for him to begin with.
No, but being the big park. No, there were a lot of people. And then we get tariffs, right? Yeah, tariffs. Let's show Canada. Let's show Mexico. Let's show the rest of the world. And they're going, what? My price is going to go up. You didn't tell me that. So, you know what I mean? What we say about populism is great in theory, terrible in practice. And our brief, and let's hope we don't have to have another one, the Farage, our experiment with, and what have we got now, it's not populism, whatever your criticisms of Starmer, it's not populism, is that it doesn't work. It makes promises it cannot keep because it goes for cheap solutions, doesn't actually care. Yeah. It's like the Rwanda plan. It loves the rhetoric and the display.
Performative cruelty. And to be fair, the American public did vote Trump out of office when they got a chance to. They didn't re-elect him after his handling of the pandemic. Yeah. So, it's not a foregone conclusion. But I think the concern is that this administration will fundamentally reshape the notion of what it is to have a US state, what it is to have American democracy. And that will be, so is there a situation in 4 years' time when there's another election, Democrats win? I mean, I think the notion that people are even questioning that as the apparatus by which American democracy functions is part of what is so disruptive and attractive to certain people who voted for Trump. But it's interesting. I mean, let's come on to Britain. There's a few aspects here to discuss because I know, you're saying in a way the reality of Brexit, how that turned out, the impact of that on our economy, and not just Brexit. And I always like to clarify this because I think it's really, really important, because I always say that I live in a democracy. And so if the referendum campaign had been held in a fair way with information that was not misleading and people still voted for it, we live in a democracy and therefore, that's democracy. I think the nature of the campaign was extremely misleading. We don't know the influence that online political messaging had. And then we ended up with a very hard Brexit, which arguably is damaging for everybody, regardless of what you feel about Brexit or not. So let's take the very hard Brexit that we ended up with. I mean, do you think, because the media doesn't want to mention it, politicians don't want to mention anything to do with it. It was such a divisive, it was the ultimate culture war we had in Britain for a number of years in modern politics. This notion of, populism meets reality and then it fizzles out. I don't know. Is that what happened with Brexit? Or was it just that it stopped getting mentioned? All of the sort of focus went onto the economy and the cost of living crisis. And now we have Keir Starmer. And no one mentions Brexit. The Labour government doesn't mention Brexit.
So
are the American people going to see the light? What light are they going to see?
So it's like, well, let's get to Amorexit in a moment. Let's go back to Brexit. There is now a clear majority to be drawn. There's now, as you know, a majority just of the invasion. People agree with the invasion of Iraq. Now you can't find anybody who remembers being supporting Iraq. And Brexit is heading that way. And obviously, there's a cultural cringe around it. Starmer doesn't want to reignite it. You want to bury it. Nobody wants to talk about it. Reanimate that whole kind of cultural war debate. But slowly, by watching, you know, and some people do tear apart the Brexit. Jeremy Clarkson suddenly said how ridiculous Brexit was. Slowly, one by one, slowly, people go, that was a bad idea. My food's more expensive. I really like going to Europe. It wasn't this great thing. They didn't spend another 350 million pound a week on the NHS. And slowly people are radicalised en masse, but slowly de-radicalised.
It's interesting what Nigel Farage says about it. He is quite pointed. Yeah. He always says, I agree. It wasn't implemented in the way it should have been.
Yeah.
Very interesting. It's not my fault. It's the Conservative government.
No, he pushed for it and he had no plan. You know, so that's classic populism. Farage is now it's immigration. He never has a plan.
But no one's really. I guess I'm just pushing you on this a bit. This notion of populism meets reality.
Yeah.
But no one has voted. I mean, do you think Brexit is something that's in people's minds? Or has had a cumulative effect on the point Britain has got to, and now we have
I think
different
if
government.
plurality. If we had a rejoin, there may be motions. We'll find out later this week to have a proper rejoin moment. I mean, personally, I would say it's, you know, you might have it's too early. You know, you've got to wait a bit longer. But that was before what happened with Vance and Trump, and them basically pushing NATO, saying withdrawing from Europe, right? So the impetus for the EU seems like a minor structure compared to our security guarantees, right? It did provide food security, it provided all sorts of good things. It wasn't life and death. This is life and death, at least for Ukrainians and maybe Europe. So I think that whole thing will seem, with the turn of the tide, and I think this is a massive motion in history, I was going to agree with you, it will never be the same again. Maybe we'll rectify it, come up with something about it. We could talk about what else could replace Trump in America, what he's actually doing in America, what could replace the role of America here. But that trust is gone. And in that light, Brexit seems stupid because geographically, if America was a bridge from, Britain was a bridge from America to Europe, you know, had that close proximity for World War II, an alliance, had the security guarantees of Five Eyes. If America goes Nazi, where does Britain go? It has to come back to Europe because that's the only place which has any concordance with the values of its people, the idea of the rule of law, the idea of anti-corruption. So I see the Brexit debate being basically overwhelmed by Exit and America's exit from the world of organizations and the rule of law. And in time, it will just seem inevitable we're back with Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite some task that whichever politician wants to make the argument about having to go back closer to Europe, notwithstanding recent developments.
Don't you think Starmer's already done it?
It's going to be really difficult.
I think Starmer's done it. So we get complaints about it. You're so critical of Starmer on the paper, on social media. I can't enough of Byline Times criticising this government. And rightly so, that's what we do, hold power to account. But I was quite staggered by the speed of his statement contradicting what Trump had said, basically they'll never join NATO, right? No. And he says inevitable, Starmer says, the Ukraine will join NATO. He also said he will send troops on the front line. His meeting with Macron this week. That is the cautious guy who always sticks with America, who plays nice with the big guy, with the American. That's quite an extraordinary moment.
Well, that's I agree. That's not cautious, but that is different from having a conversation about Britain's place in the world. So Brexit.
Can I just say though, I think when you talk to a lot of the Brexiteers, Daniel Hannan, key one in the Conservative Party, Farage obviously keep close to America, and Charge keeps quite close to Russia too. But that's another story. It's okay. We're transatlantic, right? That was the backup Europe. We've got this thing over here. We speak the same language. We watch the same TV shows. Our actors go there, put American accents on. They're the really big guys. We can forget Europe. That's gone.
That is gone. But this is still different from Starmer saying, we need to look at Britain's place in the world. It's what's going on at the moment is he's implicitly signaling that we understand things have changed, and he has made these statements with regards to Ukraine. But that is still different from saying to the British public, global Britain, that thing that was promised in the wake of Brexit, never really materialized. A lot of it was slogans and sound bites. You know, we were world beating at everything. And to be fair to the Starmer administration, something that's been interesting is that we haven't heard much about, you know, the mythic notion of Great Britain and flags and those sorts of Brexit culture war iconography hasn't seeped into how Keir Starmer is running things. But there is still, in my opinion, a lack of discussion, a lack of narrative about, well, if the global Britain that we were promised after Brexit, where Britain stands alone in this sort of, you know, hark back to what we did when we were an imperial sort of nation, we can do again. If that didn't work, this notion of global Britain, but what is Britain now? And I guess this is where the Starmer government is still not really articulating it. Perhaps it will, in light of what's happening in Ukraine, in light of these geopolitical shifts with America. But again, what is the vision for that? And I mean, it comes back down to something that's a wider issue, because I mean, it's been really interesting the first month of Trump, and you know, people are questioning, well, where's the defense? Where is the sort of fight back? What's going on? Where are the Democrats? And also, I think this notion that people are accepting of slowly, which is there is no immediate sense of what the fight back is. You know, how do you counter a Trump administration with Elon Musk in the Oval Office? You know, how do you do that? How is this? It's gone way beyond sort of some political messaging on social media. These are algorithms which are reframing how people even make sense of the world. And this notion of narratives and storytelling sits at the heart of all of this, which I've argued a lot that it's still not appreciated. You know, it's not just about the economy and improving people's material conditions. This is about telling them, making them feel something, making them feel alive and positive and hopeful and part of something. And in a way, that's also not just relevant of America. It's very relevant of what's going on here in terms of beyond sort of this government of service we were promised by Keir Starmer, focusing on public services and the economy. What is the wider story about what Britain is now and is going to be? I think it's a sign that the left or the liberals or progressives or non-right political spectrum, the ideas aren't necessarily there. I
mean, you know, you write about this consistently and brilliantly, and that is the huge problem that the populists have the best stories. So obviously, you know, make America great again, you know, take back control, you know, up on the high seas, you know, buccaneering global Britain.
It's all empowered.
Farage doesn't have that story. What he has is a narrative of fear, right? They've given up global Britain. They've given up. They're just saying, watch out, there's migrants.
But what narrative and story does Starmer have?
No, exactly. So look, which I just say, they're great at narratives. These narratives may not be rooted very much in reality. And a narrative to be really good, to be gripping, but if it's to be really productive, it has to be adaptive. It has to help the country in some way navigate the rough seas of the future. And I'm just really struck by what you were saying, like, we haven't had that discussion. You know, we didn't really, the last big phase of British, the two phases, one was we basically gave our empire over to America. Chagos Islands, all these bases, they said, we can't afford this anymore. We're giving independence for India, independence to all these other countries, and America, you police the high seas, you police the world. It was never discussed. I mean, it became apparent like moments like Suez where America said, you can't do that. Oh, sorry, they were the bosses. And it's only emerged retrospectively that what happened. It probably took 20 years for us to realize, oh yeah, that's what's happened. Then we had the whole European debate, basically the 70s onwards, we're putting sovereignty, and then there's reaction against that. So maybe it's a British thing. These stories sometimes only manifest themselves in through actions. And I think, you know, there's a word for this, but it's this idea that you only get the story. We're dramatists after all. It's not a big vision on a tricolor in France or in the American Constitution. The British kind of, they famously stumbled, on an empire by accident, a fit of, indifference. So I think there is the beginning of the moves to a bolder narrative about the rule of law, Europe, this new idea of the nation, of a comity of nations, rules-based rather than empire or nationalism. Though there are lots of forces against that, a lot of nationalist forces going on. Where do you body it? Yes, obviously, public service is just a catchphrase. I mean, it's true and it's good and they aren't as corrupt and all that. It's not a great narrative, a bureaucratic narrative like that. Though you have great narratives for that in the NHS and clap for carers. I think the Ukrainian narrative is very strong because, people who generally, like, who's the woman talk radio, I just noticed with Hardeep Matharu, right? Even she's really firm and tearing apart people being pro-Putin. There is a bit like the late 1930s, a concordat around the bravery of the Ukrainian people, how wrong Putin is. And that narrative of resistance, if alone, again, this the David Lowe cartoon I use, that we will, our fists, we used to go our fists against the rest of the world. It's, against the Catholic Church, was the Reformation, then against Napoleon, then against Hitler. Well, it's been that against the EU. They tapped into this island sense that we're resistant, we're different against you. Very powerful myth, the White Cliffs of Dover. What if those White Cliffs are against Putin and against America, right? There is a great mythic narrative of we stand alone, this sceptred isle, and we're out in the sea against, we're different. Angles basically came from the word ange, angels, because when some Roman Empire saw slaves from Britain, he thought they looked like angels. I think some story like that. And so I do think this British narrative of difference, of being a fortress, could be turned towards something else.
I mean, it could, and I think there's a need for a narrative. I mean, there's a need for compelling storytelling. But, when I've raised this in the past, some people have argued, well, we can't just take the tools that work for the right and do them on the left. And I've always said it's about how the left or the non-right progressive element of politics, how they understand the forces that have shaped the modern political right and find a way to confront them without compromising on their own values.
Right.
I think that is what is required. And I think one of the things that has struck me about, Trump and Putin, it's all very simple. I mean, Trump, I'll come into office, the war will be done very quickly, I'll end it. It's all very simple messaging, simple sound bites. I mean, I'm not making a new point. This is very obvious. That is a big part of Trump's appeal, rather than offering sort of detailed policy initiatives. We'll build the wall. We're going to deport lots of people. We are going to do America first. And it's very easy for people to understand. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is, actually the reality is we live in an increasingly complex world, but we also live in a political culture in which we are increasingly encouraged to be simplified in the ways in which we even think about what is going on around us. And so I don't think the solution for the non-right element of the political spectrum is just to adopt simple sound bites and, easy narratives. I think it has to be in some grounding of the complexity of the world. And actually, there are many different things going on. There are conflicting and contradictory issues that need to be teased out often. But how do politicians on the left make those arguments in a way that is compelling? Because as it stands, what is compelling is the simple sound bites, the simple narratives, which are very clear to people who don't predominantly see politics as about politics. It's not central to their lives. And so if it's a peripheral issue, which is just sort of going on around them, and occasionally they're asked to vote, well, then the simple, clear messaging is what they're going to pick up on. So where is the room even for complexity? And I would argue that is the ultimate One of the ultimate wins of the modern political right is to close the space in which nuance and ambiguity and complexity can even sit. And I don't see any way currently in which this is being confronted by people of more progressive and left-leaning politics.
You and I probably abhor the way that Labour are using the migrant debate and sort of echoing. But that aside, some of the key claims of both Brexit and MAGA, drain the swamp, take back control, resonated with people, especially after 2008, because they felt elites had taken over, their wages were flatlining.
I mean, it's always incredible that we hardly ever mention the financial crisis of 2008 and what a schism it caused.
But capitalism failed.
It was such a moment.
But the idea that capitalism was a reward for hard work failed when they bailed out billionaires and we had to pay for them.
Which is inherently seen as unfair.
And showed that capitalism was rescued by the state. I mean, it's socialism, communism for the rich, right? And so it just proved that capitalism, that free market neoliberalism didn't work. And yet the gains of that redistribution, distribution upwards, and the sense of elites being in control and competing elites, and let's blame. So I think, Hardeep, no, of course they are better at tapping into these narratives, though they're lying with some of those days. We didn't take back control, we lost control. We will take, with trade, with Brexit. They didn't build the wall. They didn't drain the swamp. In fact, the swamp's got swampier. If you look at all those rich people and billionaires and Musk contracts, all that. But I think more profound thing you'll get out, there is no shape of history which the progressives can conjure anymore. So the right, they have recurrently stories of 30s, from the fascist right. Capitalism doesn't work. It's run by Jews. It's unfair. It creates this chaos and cities and this weird culture. Let's all gather together as fascisti, as brothers, and worship, Sandstall. And then you had a countervailing narrative starting with the New Deal and social democracy. No, we can, if the state works in alliance, provides a consumer society with union rights and with capitalism, it can work. And then that seemed to be triumphant with the collapse of the wall. Communism doesn't work anymore. In a way, we've just had the collapse of capitalism. And it's promised to redistribute at some point to everybody. The consumer society we'll all become a little bit richer. Trickle down will happen. And trickle down has not happened. It's been trickled up. So you've got this growing inequality. And what's the narrative? The narrative of the right is we'll smash those elites, right? We'll take over, don't trust them, bankers, globalists. It's all that, they go to war. That's very different from neoliberalism, from Bush. They're always going on about neocons and globalists, all the stuff which Blair and Bush sort of bought into. And what's our answer to that?
Well, I think part of the issue is that politicians on the left and the progressive end of the political spectrum have still been unwilling to look at themselves. Because I think what is true is that the system isn't working. Regardless of what you think the solution to that is, it's not working. And that requires those politicians to also look in the mirror and turn that inquiry on themselves.
Be more authentic, have doubt, like your essay about Margaret
part,
Thatcher saying, I don't know.
I don't know, but also looking at the structures in which they operate.
Yeah.
And so, for example, a recent report in the Times newspaper was quite illuminating in this regard. It was a report about the Labour Party. People might remember that ahead of the general election last July, Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the party, did a lot of work to talk about this ethics sort of commission that a new Labour government would set up in light of things like the PPE scandal, the Baroness Mone issue, all kinds of things that were seen as being corrupting of sort of the way Whitehall was being run under Boris Johnson and other Conservative governments. And it emerged in this Times report recently that at that point, there was a notion that what was being proposed was some of the loopholes around political donations were going to be closed, which would have prevented companies that are sort of registered in the UK, wherever the money comes from for those companies, from donating to to parties, unincorporated associations. And it emerged in this report that isn't now going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen, according to this report, is because Lord Wahid Ali, who is one of Labour's biggest donors, apparently intervened. Now, this is an example of where there is no looking in the mirror in terms of the structural terrain in which the Labour Party is operating in. That loophole, it's doubtful as to whether that is now going to be closed. Elon Musk could donate however many millions to the Reform Party, for example. Now it would be seen as in reaction to Elon Musk. No doubt the Labour government is in part quite fearful of what kind of backlash on Twitter or X that might cause. What I'm trying to say is that is doing business as usual, kowtowing to a donor of your party who's intervened.
I agree.
And so this is part of the issue. This recognition that the system is broken has to involve a really honest reevaluation of what that means before you can even get to the formulating of narratives and a compelling story to tell on the other side of it. I question whether that's happening.
Well, the thing, it's an interactive process, right? We did a lot of work on the PPE stuff, broke the story for a year before the NIO followed it, and other people followed it, and the Guardian got more details on Baroness Mone. And I'd argue our work there did make a difference. You know, we opened up, made other papers follow it, and there is a commission of limited powers, it seems, Rachel Reeves set up. So on that, I mean, I think what happens is they think it's cost-free to make it's keep that loophole open. That means that somebody can give us £5 million, right?
Right.
And that is a no-go, right? You know, I think it's completely wrong. But in the long run, that's better for Labour because then we'll look after people's interests, even if we have to do this. You know, they think it's a good thing. And so what you have to do is tell the narrative that it's not a cost-free thing. It's a really bad thing to do. These narratives are shaped in real time, like a drama. Everybody's telling their own story. And we have to just make sure the stories know that looks selfish. It's like, you know, in the short-term gain, you can exploit it, but then they can exploit it next time. There's some standards and make it punitive and expensive for them to take this easy route out. And I think this, you know, in that way, the extremity of Trump and Musk is very handy because you can point to a living case of where Musk will give £30 million to Tommy Robinson. You know, it's not abstract. He's actually said he should join Reform and he should get rid of Farage. You know, it's not abstract. Oh, America might leave NATO. America is trying to meet with Putin to do a deal over Europe without Europe there. You know, and so yes, I think that the story is a democracy of rule of law. That's not very exciting. So how do you make that a resistance story? How do you make it Lord of the Rings, the Shire, the Ring of getting rid of the Ring of Power? How do you make, which I think is a myth of Britain born out of two world wars. You know, Tolkien fought in World War One. He's writing in World War Two. The sense that how can the little guy, literally little in the case of hobbits, stand out against these big global forces? So we have to find these stories somehow which animate people to a sense of adventure, a sense that they have agency, they're part of a story. You know, they're not passively watching it.
And that democracy isn't working.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's not the reason to chuck it out completely, but it's not working. And I think that recognition is important. I mean, the thing that I find most striking listening to what you're saying, Peter, because you're right, the Cold War was all about these competing superpowers. And, you know, so I understand it. I wasn't there at the time, but everyone was on edge about what was going to happen. Now you've come all the other way. You've got Putin and Trump, Russia and America at the same table, sort of in alliance with each other in some way. So it really has come full circle, and perhaps not in a way most people will like listening to this podcast. But at the same time, I think what is really striking is for everybody who is a fan of Trump, he is getting rid of that old world order that you're talking about.
And it can't be changed.
And that is extraordinary because he is arguably doing what he said he would do.
No,
This system doesn't work. I'm going to do things differently.
Absolutely.
And what is the competing narrative to that? And maybe you're right that it should be about changing democracy and defending it and the rule of law and sort of peace in Europe. But arguably on the scale of America, Kamala Harris ran on that. It was all about Trump is going to eradicate democracy. We've got to keep democracy. It didn't work. And so, I mean, I'm not saying Europe and the UK, we have very different political cultures from America, but I guess that's the quandary, that the more Trump does these things that are extremely concerning and so far out of the Overton window as it has been, the more he satisfies that, I would say, more visceral urge, emotionally, psychologically driven urge in people that the system isn't working, things have to just change. And he is the one who's delivering that.
So I'd completely agree, but every huge movement contains the seeds of its opposition. And what you see is, and I believe, right, these abstract things like the rule of law, peace in Europe, these are, we've heard this for years, will no longer become abstract. Yeah. So one thing that could have as a result is this massive, one of the key problems, particularly in America, but in Europe too, is this growing inequality of wealth, right? And so one thing 2008 was to stop the bank machines. They poured even more quantitative easing to the hyper rich, right? So that's why the assets of the rich have gone up and the average wages have gone down. The thing that corrects that is war, famine, or catastrophe, because suddenly labor is important. People lose a lot of capital. Banks collapse, let the bondholders take that. If they can't hold us hostage, the cash machines stop, then they would. And suddenly war depletes capital. Labor is important. And so I think you could see something on that scale, or probably on that to reduce, this sense of inequality. And I think you're right. The system has built up these pressures, but only rectified by something very dramatic. And then the story will be 1939. The story will be the brave resistance against it. It won't be an abstract thing. It'll be a real thing. Say if Russia launches, already at war in the Baltics, already cutting cables. It's already, if it's launches an attack on the Suwalki Gap where Kaliningrad is, what would Europe do there? And I think then it all becomes very real to people. They would bear sacrifices like they did with COVID. We'd have to pull together. The resources of the state would have to be put towards the collective endeavour of self-defence.
And really, Peter, I mean, just the final area I want to come on to, which I think is related to all of this, is Reform UK and Nigel Farage. This is going to be a key area for Byline Times to keep covering in the years ahead. Most prominently because the established press doesn't seem to be learning its lessons of the Boris Johnson years. There's a lot of elevation of Farage's status without the requisite scrutiny of his rhetoric and his positions. I mean, is that one form of reality hitting us in the face, that if Reform does emerge in the years ahead as the sort of credible opposition party to the Labour government? I mean, we had a poll in recent weeks, just a poll, and I always say one poll in 1 year with 4 years to go to a general election doesn't really mean much at all. But this notion that Reform has overtaken Labour in some of the national polling, I mean, in terms of, we've got this big geopolitical strife going on. Domestically, internally, do you think the march of Farage and Reform could be a galvanising moment? I mean, there are already reports and rumours that the Labour Party is well aware that they need to snatch some of that territory back, and their approach, as you've intimated, has been to film these videos of people being put on deportation, being deported, which is interesting approach to take, very populist, very much from the modern political right. But what is your take? Because I mean, I'm basing this on some of the signalling of the established press, including the BBC, in how Farage is already being framed as potentially Britain's next prime minister, still with 4 years to go. And in particular, I mean, if people can find this online, I would encourage them to read it. A recent profile of Farage in the London Evening Standard.
Owned by?
Lord Evgeny Lebedev. So this profile was conducted by feature writer Dylan Jones. The iconography was all there. I mean, there was a picture of Farage in a Union Jack tie with glasses, which I didn't know he wears glasses, a bit like Michael Caine, some commented, with a fag, from his mouth. And very iconic. It was an interview in which he was, saying essentially, well, I've just been a disruptor of British politics. Now I want to take it over. The biggest problem that we've had is uncontrolled migration growth. This has changed the quality of life in this country. And a piece in which he was essentially framed as the next big thing. I find that very concerning. And I wonder whether, regardless of what's going on geopolitically, even internally, some of those moments where we have to reckon with reality are already heading our way. A Farage government. Is that so beyond the realm of possibility?
Well, Hardeep, you've answered your own question brilliantly, and I think I was going to ask you what you thought about it, and you've described definitely on manoeuvres, all the press on manoeuvres. Adam also wrote a piece, they're doing the Boris thing. There was Groom, the next successor. It's not, Blair fighting Brown. There was Boris was changing Cameron. They love all this stuff, and they don't scrutinise. I agree, and we said Farage reform is in a way the biggest threat to the next election. The far-right connections, which only we seem to be exposing. Farage meeting with members of the far-right, support for AfD, it's for Le Pen. I mean, it's like they forget all that and they're just making the child. And
I get interesting comments around Ukraine. That was one of the only points in the general election campaign last year where, it was the BBC, finally, asked him about some of his comments on Ukraine. That created a few headlines.
And I think recently he's disagreed with Trump on the rare things on this. But so, yes, completely. I mean, I would say one other poll you look at is favourability ratings, whatever Reform's doing up and down the polls. The Starmer's way ahead of Badenoch and Farage in terms of popularity. So it's a one-man party. But I'd say this, Hardeep, if Farage has played this game close to Trump, close to support, saying Putin was the leader most impressed him, that's the old world. We're in a new world now. And I don't know where Farage sits in this, because he sits in that transatlantic space between Putin and Trump. And I don't think that's going to be tenable anymore.
Wow. On that note, we will have to explore what is tenable for Farage's Reform Party another time. But thank you so much for joining us to talk about the Gulf of America, Trump's first month. I was in conversation with Peter Jukes. I'm Hardeep Matharu. If for any reason you do not know about Byline Times' monthly print magazine, which funds all of our independent investigative journalism, analysis and reports, please do head over to bylinetimes.com. You can give us your regular support, or every month we are now in the newsstand. So pick up a copy. Please keep spreading the word and help us build the better media that Britain deserves.